So it seems like this day and age on the internet, people all across social media are doing these generous things for videos and quick shorts where they, give money to homeless people or pay off the student loan debt for a random bunch of subscribers. And after a while of seeing all of this, you start to ask yourself, are these people really doing it because of altruistic behavior or because, these people need it? Or are they just doing it for clicks? And then that raises another question. What exactly is altruism? Because if altruism is performing a task that benefits another individual at the cost of yourself, why do humans act altruistically in the first place? And what is the science behind that?
Welcome to The Science Behind That with Atticus Hamilton.
Hello, everybody, and welcome on back to the Science Behind That podcast. I am your host, Atticus Hamilton, and in today's episode, we're going to be going back to the psychology topics. Again, surprisingly, psychology seems to be the most popular subject on my podcast. So I figured that you guys would like this topic. As you heard from the intro, we're going to be talking about altruism, and I'm also going to be touching on one or two other things in psychology, maybe that we talked about very early on in the beginnings of this podcast, pertaining to group psychology and group behaviors. So we're going to be talking about that today, and before we get in, again, I'd like to invite all of you to grab a nice hot cup of coffee, add a little bit of maple syrup to it, and we're going to jump right in. One other thing, for those of you that listened to Monday's episode, you'll know that for the past 2 weeks before this week, if that makes sense, I was very ill, and you may be able to hear from my voice, I'm still a little nasally, still a little congested, particularly frontal sinus congestion, that sort of stuff, so my voice does still sound a little funky. I'm hoping come next week, all that funkiness will be gone. But anyway, yeah, so welcome back. Thanks for bearing with me. We're going to jump right in. So altruism is kind of an interesting topic to me. When I was in college, particularly in my introductory to psychology class, that was an awesome class, by the way. I really wish I could have taken more psych classes, but at my university, unfortunately, you were unable to take more advanced psychology classes unless you had a psych major or minor, which was stupid, I thought, but anyway, whatever. So, that was a fun class. But anyway, in that class, we did mention altruism, and it seemed to be the consensus of my professor that altruism was a visual representation of his belief that humans have moved past evolutionary urges, because from an evolutionary perspective it doesn't make sense to be altruistic. And that is something that I've seen a lot of places, not just him. For a very long time, the APA, or American Psychology Association, upholded that same idea. Now it seems like they've, changed their stance on that a little bit. But for a long time, that seemed to be their stance. But before we can get too deep into altruism, I'd like to first just throw out a basic definition and talk about some other things that I think are important, including the type of altruistic behavior you're doing, right? So altruism in a very basic sense is sort of defined as performing an activity or function, right, that immediately benefits somebody other than you at the cost of yourself, right? So an example is, if you're in high school, or maybe not high school, that's not a good example. If you're like in elementary school, and Johnny, he's not your friend. You don't really know him very well, but he's really hungry, and so you give him your lunch, right? So now he's no longer hungry, but now you're hungry. That's an altruistic behavior. Now, with humans, it seems like we tend to be more likely to perform those behaviors if it immediately benefits somebody of our bloodline and or our friends. And so what I mean by this is your parents, and some of you out there that are listening to this are parents, you'll know that comes with an inherent responsibility to be altruistic for your children, if you are parents. And and what I mean by this is when a little child is born, parents sacrifice so much of their time at a cost to themselves, honestly, to give for that children, or to give for those children or that child. I read a frightening statistic about the cost to raise just one child from the age of 0 to 18 here in America, and it's around $250,000 to fulfill just the basic requirements for clothing, housing, safety, and food. It's $250,000 per child for 18 years in America. And I don't know if that frightens you guys as much as it does me, but that's really scary because, that's just the basic minimum requirements. And I know that a lot of kids in America aren't getting that, and a lot of families in America don't have, $250,000 to spend. But so that was a very frightening statistic. But I bring that up because that's altruistic as well. The parents sacrifice maybe financial stability and security to benefit the child. And that's an altruistic behavior. So we as humans are a lot more inclined to act altruistically for either our bloodline, right, our children, maybe our parents, our siblings, and our very close friends. Like my best friend, I have known him since, I think I have known him since I was 12 years old. And I'm still friends with him now, which is absolutely mind-blowing to me. That's like almost 12 years. Anyway, but, I would do anything for him. And I'm fairly certain he would do the same thing for me. And I would definitely act altruistically for him. But when it comes to people we don't really know, that's where it gets confusing. And that's where statistics come into play. And what do I mean by this? What I mean by this is there was a study done in the 1960s, and I'm sorry, I forget the name of this study. It was called a compliance test. Now, if you look up like a compliance test on Google or something, you're going to get a lot of weird things. But a compliance test is basically a psychological test that seeks to determine how easily susceptible people are to obedience, right? So there's a classic study where you have a bunch of people in a room, right? And they're told to fill out a form. And so there's a bunch of chairs and there's 3 actors, and periodically for ringing of a bell, those actors will stand up. And a compliance test demonstrates that around 66-ish% of the time, people will blindly follow what others are doing, even when there's no direct order to do that thing. And that relates to a lot of other things. So like on exams, for example, another actually pretty famous test had a bunch of random actors or people in a room. Some of them were actors, or all of them were actors except one person who is a designated test subject. And they were all showed a picture, different pictures containing 3 different length lines. And the actors, even when they would say, if there were like 4 of them, even when they would all say that the correct, when asked which line is longer, and they would say the obviously shorter line is longer, it didn't matter that it was incorrect. The test subjects, 66% of them, would follow in with this obedience and state the wrong answers, even though they were obviously wrong. Sorry, I had to take a sip of my latte there. So that I found very interesting. But the question is, does this apply to altruistic behavior? Because what we see is there's different types of altruistic behavior. Giving some random kid you've never met your lunch at school, or giving a homeless person your leftovers when you're walking home from dinner, is radically different than taking a bullet for somebody you don't know. And the two things are still altruism. And so when we look at this, a lot of the times we see the breakdown of, what percentage of people actually do perform altruistic behavior in legitimately life or death or, very scary situations. It ends up falling on that 60% line, mimicking the compliance test statistics. And I think altruism as well also has a lot, or can have something to do with peer pressure, right? When you just think about it, the vast majority of people, if there's a crisis, a mass shooting, for example, the vast majority of people will just stand there, right? And we know this. This is called the bystander effect. But every now and then, you'll get one person who acts altruistically to subdue the attacker. A couple years ago, there was a person, again here in America, I don't remember what state it was in, but it was on a train, and he had brought a handgun with him that he had modified the firing pin to turn it from semi-automatic pistol to a fully automatic pistol, and he was gonna kill these people on the train. And there were 3 people on the train who apparently were all former military guys, and they were able to subdue him before anyone got hurt. That was altruistic behavior. And so the question then becomes, why do we do this, right? Because taking that as an example, those men who subdued the shooter were very likely putting themselves in mortal danger. They could have gotten shot, they could have gotten seriously injured, any number of things could have happened, but they did it anyway to save a trainload of people that they don't know, they've never met before. Now, why would you do that? Well, according to the American Psychology Association, some preliminary data suggests that during the action that a person is performing, so during the event of an altruistic behavior, the brain releases a lot of dopamine. And so from an emotional perspective, it feels really good for that person to perform that task, right? Which kind of flies in the face of what at least my psychology professor taught me in college, which was, that's not why people do altruistic behavior, you can't use that as a simple explanation, because then presumably an individual's evolutionary survival instincts would overweigh a short-term immediate rush of dopamine. But the data actually doesn't seem to support that. But again, the question then becomes, is this the same in a life or death situation like that last example I gave you. Did those men subdue the attacker because it felt good emotionally, or did they do it because they felt a compulsion to? They felt a desire to protect everyone on the train. And so, I try and look at everything from a science and a genetics perspective as well. Because, as we all know, our behavior, for the most part, has a genetic component to it, right? Because, for example, we do know that there are underlying genetic characteristics that make somebody more susceptible to be an extremely violent or angry person. And in fact, there's data coming out from Uppsala University in Sweden that shows just that. We know that this is interesting as well. We are now learning that an individual's microbiome may play a bigger role in their personality than social factors, than environmental factors like who they hang around, which is also very interesting. So we know that genetics and physiological phenomena have a big impact on how we appear physically and, of course, behave psychologically. And so my question then becomes, is there a possibility that altruistic tendencies are passed down from generation to generation through maybe unknown genetic characteristics? And, that I don't know. And it seems like there isn't a solid answer to that. So overall then, what did we learn, right? Overall, we learned that altruism may be governed by the fact that it feels good. When you perform a task that helps another person out, despite the fact that it hurts yourself, it feels good. The brain releases dopamine, and of course it releases natural opioids. So that may be the underlying mechanism behind it. But what did we also learn? We also learned that the actual statistics of people who perform altruistically in a genuinely life or death or severely extremely perilous situation is more in line with between 12 and 60%. Now, why do I say 12%? 12% because between 12 and 90% of people in a general situation feel peer pressure to do something if everyone around them is doing that thing as well. And so we can kind of, say between 12 and 60% of people will not act altruistically in a life or death situation. Because the vast majority of people in those situations as well fall victim to the bystander effect, right? Where they don't do anything because of our underlying psychology. They just sort of stand there and watch the situation unfold until somebody tells them, you call the police, you perform CPR, yada, yada, yada. So overall, I think what we learned is that altruism may be more ingrained in us from an evolutionary perspective than we realize. And that we're not necessarily going against our evolutionary instincts when we act altruistically, because it may derive some sort of, cognitive and behavioral benefit to us, especially if we successfully help somebody in an altruistic event. Well, then our air quote tribe, the group of people that we're in, will look at us differently. And so there's probably a lot more underlying factors going into this. And if I had to bet as well, I would say that there's probably a genetic component to it along with a social component to it. And so anyway, as with most things in psychology, it's kind of up in the air as to what the real answer is, as to what the actual underlying phenomenon is. But nonetheless, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed today's episode of The Science Behind That. Have a great weekend. I'm so happy it's finally Friday. And I will see you guys all on a Monday. And until then, remember, ladies and gentlemen, stand up and question everything.